Picture this. You're at a dinner party, confidently explaining how Roman gladiators always fought to the death, how Romans invented the Caesar salad, and how they all spoke Latin while casually vomiting between courses. Everyone nods appreciatively at your historical knowledge. There's just one tiny problem. Literally everything you just said is completely spectacularly wrong. Welcome to the wonderful world of Roman mythology, where Hollywood met heterotopcal fan fiction, and nobody bothered to fact-check. Tonight, we're dismantling every Roman fact you thought you knew, one delicious lie at a time. If you're ready to have your mind gently blown while drifting off to sleep, you know what button to hit. Trust me, your brain will thank you tomorrow. Let's start with everyone's favorite Roman myth, the gladiator death matches. Thanks to Russell Crowe and 1,000 sword and sandal movies, we picture the Colosseum as basically ancient Rome's version of a slaughterhouse, where muscled warriors fought until one lay bleeding in the sand, while emperors gave dramatic thumbs down. Here's the thing that might surprise you as you settle into your pillow tonight. Gladiator fights were rarely fatal. In fact, they were more like ancient WWE than Game of Thrones. These weren't desperate slaves fighting for their lives. They were highly trained, incredibly expensive athletes performing in a carefully choreographed entertainment industry. Think about it logically for a moment. Training a gladiator took years and cost a fortune. The average gladiator school, yes, they had schools, with professional trainers and everything, invested the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars in each fighter. Would you take your brand new Ferrari and smash it into a wall for entertainment? Of course not. The economics alone make the deathmatch narrative absurd. The reality was far more sophisticated, and honestly more interesting. Gladiatorial contests were elaborate theatrical productions. Different types of gladiators had specific fighting styles, weapons, and even costume designs. The retiarius fought with a net and trident, dressed to represent a fisherman. The secutor carried sword and shield, designed to look like a pursuing soldier. These weren't random pairings, they were carefully planned matchups that told stories, often with mythological themes. Most gladiators were professionals who fought perhaps 3 to 5 times per year. They had agents, fan clubs and endorsement deals. Successful gladiators became celebrities, with their faces on oil lamps and their names graffitied on walls by adoring fans. Some even had their own action figures. Well, the Roman equivalent of action figures, the thumbs up and thumbs down thing. Also largely Hollywood invention. Ancient sources suggest various hand gestures were used, but the specific thumb directions we associate with life and death decisions probably weren't standardized the way movies suggest. The editor, the person putting on the games, might consult the crowd, but the decision was usually based on how well both fighters had performed, not some arbitrary death quota. When gladiators did die, it was often accidental, or the result of particularly brutal contests put on for special occasions. The average mortality rate was closer to what you'd see in modern boxing than in a horror movie. Gladiators who were wounded received excellent medical care, because again, they were valuable investments. Let that sink in for a moment as you get comfortable. The image of bloodthirsty Romans cheering for death is largely a projection of our own assumptions about ancient brutality. The Romans were certainly capable of extreme violence. Public executions of criminals could be genuinely horrific, but gladiatorial games were entertainment, not execution. The gladiator schools themselves were fascinating institutions. They were part military academy, part athletic training facility, and part acting school. Gladiators learned not just how to fight, but how to die dramatically if necessary, how to work a crowd, and how to sell the narrative of their particular character type. Some gladiators were indeed slaves, or prisoners of war, but many were free men who chose the profession for the potential wealth and fame. Successful gladiators could earn enough to buy their freedom, purchase property, and retire comfortably. Some even became trainers or started their own schools. The women gladiators, gladiatresses, add another layer to this story that movies consistently ignore. Yes, women fought in the arena, and they were popular enough that several emperors tried to ban female gladiatorial contests, suggesting they were drawing audiences away from traditional male fights. So the next time someone confidently explains how Roman gladiators were expendable slaves fighting to the death, you can gently correct them, or don't. Sometimes it's more fun to let people believe the dramatic version. But as you drift off tonight, picture instead a world where ancient athletes performed in elaborate shows, complete with costumes, storylines, and carefully choreographed action sequences. It's actually much more impressive than mindless slaughter, don't you think? Now that we've dismantled the gladiator death cult, let's tackle perhaps the most delightfully disgusting myth about Roman dining, the vomitorium. You know this story. Decadent Romans would feast until they couldn't eat another bite, then politely excuse themselves to the vomitorium to purge, making room for the next course. It's the ultimate symbol of Roman excess and gluttony, proof that ancient civilization was both sophisticated and completely unhinged. Except here's the beautiful irony. Vomitoriums had absolutely nothing to do with vomiting. Nothing. Zero. The word comes from the Latin vomere, which means to spew forth, but not in the digestive sense. Vomitoriums were the exit passages in Roman amphitheatres and stadiums, the architectural features that allowed crowds to spew forth from the building quickly and efficiently. Think of them as ancient Rome's version of modern stadium exit ramps. When 50,000 people needed to leave the Colosseum after a show, they used the vomitoriums, the corridors and stairways designed to handle massive crowd flow. The Romans were brilliant urban planners, and they understood that getting people out of a venue safely was just as important as getting them in. This linguistic mix-up is actually a perfect example of how historical myths develop. Someone, somewhere along the line, heard the word vomitorium, made an assumption based on our modern associations with Roman decadence, and the story took on a life of its own. It's like a historical game of telephone, where each retelling makes the story more dramatic and further from the truth. The real Roman dining culture was certainly elaborate, but not in the cartoonish way we imagine. Wealthy Romans did host elaborate dinner parties called convivium, which could last for hours and feature multiple courses, but the idea that they regularly induced vomiting to continue eating is largely fantasy. Romans did sometimes use emetics, substances that induce vomiting, but this was typically for medicinal purposes, not recreational gluttony. Ancient medical theory held that balancing the body's humors was essential for health, and purging was sometimes prescribed as treatment. It wasn't a party trick. The confusion might also stem from Roman attitudes toward excess that were genuinely different from ours. They did value abundance and display at formal dinners. A proper Roman feast might include exotic foods, elaborate presentation, and entertainment, but this was about showing wealth and status, not about eating until you literally couldn't function. Let's paint a more accurate picture of Roman dining culture as you settle in for the night. The typical Roman day included a light breakfast, a modest lunch, and the main meal in the late afternoon or evening. For ordinary citizens, this meant bread, olive oil, wine mixed with water, and perhaps some cheese, vegetables, or fish. Wealthy Romans had access to much more variety. They might serve multiple courses, exotic ingredients from across the empire, and elaborate preparations. But even lavish banquets followed social rules and customs. Guests reclined on couches arranged around a central table, with specific positions indicating social status. The meal was as much about conversation, business dealings, and social networking as about food. The entertainment at these dinners could include music, poetry readings, or philosophical discussions. Some hosts hired professional entertainers, dancers, musicians, or performers. The atmosphere was meant to be sophisticated and cultured, not a free-for-all of gluttony. What's fascinating is how this myth reveals our own cultural assumptions. We want to believe that ancient Romans were either paragons of civilization or complete decadence. The vomitorium story satisfies our need to see them as excessively indulgent, confirming that we're more reasonable and restrained than our predecessors. But Romans themselves often criticized excessive behavior. Seneca wrote extensively about the virtues of moderation. Roman literature is full of satires mocking people who overindulged in food, drink, or luxury. The cultural ideal, at least among the educated classes, valued self-control and dignity. The architectural reality of actual vomitoriums is much more impressive than the fictional digestive ones. Roman engineers designed these exit systems to prevent crowd disasters, something modern venue designers still struggle with. The curved corridors and multiple exit points could empty enormous buildings in minutes, a feat of crowd management that wouldn't be matched again for centuries. So where did Romans actually go when they needed to? Well, digest. Wealthy homes had private latrines, often quite luxurious, with marble seats and running water. Public bathhouses included communal toilets. Yes, communal, which is its own fascinating cultural difference. But these were social spaces where people conducted business and chatted while attending to bodily functions. The next time someone brings up Roman vomitoriums at dinner, and honestly, Why does this topic come up so often at meals? You can share the real story, or better yet, redirect the conversation to the genuinely impressive Roman innovations in architecture, engineering, and urban planning. Though I suppose they built really efficient stadium exits doesn't have quite the same shock value as they had special rooms for throwing up between courses. As you drift off tonight, imagine instead those massive Roman crowds flowing smoothly through carefully designed passages, the result of brilliant engineering and urban planning. It's actually a much more remarkable achievement than ritualized vomiting when you think about it. Here's a question to ponder as you get comfortable. What language did Julius Caesar speak when he crossed the Rubicon? If you answered Latin, congratulations, you've fallen for one of history's most persistent myths. While Caesar certainly knew Latin, the language he used for his famous declaration was almost certainly Greek. This might seem like a minor detail, but it reveals something fascinating about how we misunderstand Roman culture. We picture Romans as these stern, practical people speaking formal Latin in marble halls. The reality was far more cosmopolitan, and frankly, more interesting. Latin was indeed the official language of Roman administration, law, and formal literature. But the Roman Empire was a multilingual, multicultural civilization that spanned 3 continents. In the Eastern Mediterranean, Greek remained the language of culture, philosophy, and educated discourse. Wealthy Romans were bilingual, as a matter of course, and many considered Greek more sophisticated than Latin for intellectual conversations. Think of it like modern international business. English might be the lingua franca, but deals get made in Mandarin, contracts are negotiated in German, and the most important conversations often happen in the native languages of the participants. Rome worked similarly. When Caesar allegedly said, "Eleo acta est," the die is cast. As he crossed the Rubicon, ancient historians suggest he actually spoke in Greek. The phrase they recorded was aneritho kaidos, a quote from a play by Menander. This wasn't showing off. It was natural for an educated Roman to reference Greek literature in the original language. The Romans themselves were quite frank about their cultural borrowing. They acknowledged that they had conquered Greece militarily, but were conquered by Greece intellectually. Roman literature, philosophy, art, and architecture were heavily influenced by Greek models. Many Roman authors wrote in both languages, and some preferred Greek for serious intellectual work. Latin itself evolved dramatically throughout Roman history. The formal, literary Latin we associate with Cicero and Virgil, what scholars call classical Latin, was already somewhat artificial even in their time. It was the equivalent of extremely formal, elevated prose. The Latin actually spoken on Roman streets was earthier, more flexible, and constantly changing. This everyday Latin, called vulgar Latin, though vulgar here just means of the people, was the ancestor of modern Romance languages. Spanish, Italian, French, Portuguese, and Romanian all evolved from the Latin that soldiers, merchants, and ordinary citizens actually spoke, not from the polished literary version that survived in books. Regional variations were enormous. Latin spoken in Gaul developed differently from Latin in Spain or North Africa. Local languages influenced pronunciation, vocabulary, and grammar. A Roman soldier stationed in Britain would have spoken quite differently from a merchant in Alexandria, even if both were theoretically speaking Latin. The multilingual reality of the Roman world becomes even clearer when you consider the army. Roman legions recruited from across the empire, bringing together speakers of Celtic languages, Germanic dialects, Aramaic, various African languages, and dozens of others. Military Latin developed its own vocabulary and simplified grammar to facilitate communication among troops who might share no other common language. Roman graffiti, and yes, Romans were prolific graffitiers, appears in multiple languages and scripts. Pompeii's walls feature Latin, Greek, Oscan, a local Italian language, and even some Aramaic. People wrote in whatever language felt natural for their message, audience, or mood. The educated classes routinely code-switched between languages mid-sentence, much like multilingual people do today. A Roman senator might begin a speech in formal Latin, quote a Greek philosopher in the original, and drop into colloquial Latin for a joke. This linguistic flexibility was considered sophisticated, not confusing. Religious practices add another layer to this linguistic complexity. Mystery cults often preserved their sacred texts and rituals in original languages. Greek for Dionysiac rites, Egyptian for Isis worship, Persian for Mithraism, Christianity initially spread in Greek, even in Rome itself. The New Testament was written in Greek, not Latin, because that was the language of early Christian communities. Even Roman names reflect this multilingual reality. Marcus Tullius Cicero had a Latin name, but many prominent Romans bore Greek names: Cassius Dio, Appian, Plutarch. Others had Gaulish, Germanic, or Middle Eastern names that were Romanized to varying degrees. The persistence of the Romans spoke Latin myth probably stems from our educational system, where students encounter Roman literature in translation or study classical Latin as a dead language. We don't experience the living, breathing, multilingual world that actual Romans inhabited. It's also easier to imagine Romans as linguistically uniform, because it makes them seem more like a modern nation-state. But Rome was an empire, not a nation, and empires by definition are multilingual, multicultural entities, held together by administration and military force, not by shared language or ethnicity. Trade languages add yet another dimension. Around the Mediterranean, various pidgin languages developed to facilitate commerce. A Roman merchant trading in India might use Greek, Latin, and local languages, plus whatever trading pidgin had evolved in that particular port. So the next time you picture Romans delivering grand speeches in formal Latin, remember that the reality was much more linguistically rich and complex. Caesar probably crossed the Rubicon speaking Greek. Ordinary Romans mixed languages freely in daily conversation, and the Latin that survived in literature was just one strand of a vast multilingual tapestry. As you settle in for sleep tonight, imagine that cosmopolitan world where languages flowed together like rivers meeting the sea, more diverse, more dynamic, and ultimately more human than our simplified textbook version. Linguistic diversity wasn't a problem Romans solved. It was a resource they exploited to build one of history's most successful civilizations. Let's drift into one of history's most emotionally charged myths: the systematic persecution of Christians in ancient Rome. Close your eyes and you probably see something from a Sunday school illustration. Noble Christians being fed to lions while bloodthirsty pagans cheer, underground worship in candlelit catacombs, centuries of relentless oppression by Roman authorities. Here's what might surprise you as you get comfortable tonight. For most of Roman history, nobody really cared what gods you worshipped. The Romans were remarkably tolerant of religious diversity, to the point where they actively collected foreign deities like some people collect vintage wines. The systematic persecution of Christians was relatively brief, sporadic, and often had more to do with politics than theology. This doesn't minimize the genuine suffering of individual Christians who were executed, imprisoned, or harassed. But the popular narrative of 3 centuries of constant persecution simply doesn't match the historical evidence. Most Christians lived their entire lives without any interference from Roman authorities. Roman religious policy was fundamentally pragmatic. They had conquered an enormous empire filled with hundreds of different cultures, each with their own gods, rituals, and beliefs. Rather than try to suppress all these diverse traditions, which would have been both impossible and counterproductive, they generally incorporated them into the broader Roman religious system. The key requirement was that local communities also participate in the imperial cult, basically showing loyalty to Rome and the emperor through certain ritual observances. This wasn't usually seen as exclusive worship. Most people happily honored both their local gods and the imperial deities. It was more like pledging allegiance to the flag while also supporting your local sports team. Christians ran into trouble, not because Romans hated their theology, but because early Christianity was exclusive in a way that Roman religion generally wasn't. Christians refused to participate in imperial rituals, which Romans interpreted as political disloyalty rather than religious conviction. From a Roman perspective, asking someone to burn a pinch of incense to the emperor's genius wasn't a big theological statement, it was basic civic duty. The sporadic persecutions that did occur were often responses to specific political crises. When things went badly for the empire, military defeats, natural disasters, economic problems, some officials looked for scapegoats. Christians were convenient targets because they were visible minorities who had already marked themselves as potentially disloyal by refusing standard civic religious duties. But even during persecution periods, enforcement was inconsistent and localized. A Christian might face harassment in one city while their co-religionists lived peacefully just a few miles away. Much depended on local officials, community relations, and immediate political circumstances. The famous persecution under Diocletian, often cited as the most severe, lasted about 10 years and was primarily focused on Christian clergy and property, not ordinary believers. Even then, many regions saw little actual enforcement. By this time, the early 300 CE, Christians had been a visible minority in the empire for over 2 centuries, during most of which they practiced their faith openly. Archaeological evidence supports this more nuanced picture. Christian symbols appear on Roman tombstones, jewelry and household items throughout the imperial period, often alongside traditional Roman motifs. If Christians were constantly hiding their faith, we wouldn't expect to see such open displays of Christian identity. The catacomb story adds another interesting layer to this myth. While Christians did bury their dead in underground cemeteries around Rome, these weren't secret hiding places. Catacombs were legal burial grounds, often quite elaborate, with decorative artwork and family gathering spaces. Both Christians and pagans used similar underground cemeteries throughout the Roman world. The dramatic imagery of Christians worshipping by candlelight in hidden tunnels, while avoiding Roman soldiers, makes for compelling storytelling. But it misrepresents how most early Christians actually lived. By the 2nd century CE, Christian communities had established churches, appointed bishops, and developed sophisticated theological literature, none of which would have been possible under constant persecution. What's particularly ironic is how this persecution narrative obscures the more interesting story of how Christianity actually spread through the Roman Empire. Rather than growing despite Roman oppression, Christianity often thrived because of Roman infrastructure and policies. Roman roads made missionary travel easier. Roman law provided mechanisms for appealing unjust local decisions. The common languages of the empire, Greek and Latin, allowed Christian texts to circulate widely. The Roman postal system, urban centers, and trade networks all facilitated the spread of Christian ideas. Many early Christian converts were precisely the people who benefited most from Roman civilization. Educated urban dwellers, merchants, artisans, and even some government officials. Christianity's growth pattern followed Roman trade routes and urban centers, not the desperate communities of the oppressed. The transformation under Constantine wasn't as sudden as often portrayed either. Constantine's conversion and the Edict of Milan in 313 CE legalized Christianity, but by then Christians probably comprised 10–15% of the empire's population. The religion had already achieved critical mass through normal social and economic networks, not through the heroic resistance of persecuted minorities. Even the famous Lion's Den executions, while certainly real in some cases, were probably less common than popular imagination suggests. Romans did execute criminals by exposing them to wild animals, but this was a standard punishment for certain crimes, not a specifically anti-Christian practice. Christians condemned to death in this manner died alongside murderers, bandits, and military deserters. The persistence of the persecution myth probably serves several purposes. It provides a dramatic origin story for Christianity that emphasizes the faith of early believers. It creates a clear good versus evil narrative that's emotionally satisfying, and it allows later Christians to identify with the suffering of their spiritual ancestors. But as you settle into sleep tonight, consider the more complex reality, a vast, diverse empire, where people of different faiths generally coexisted peacefully, where religious innovation and syncretism were normal, and where Christianity grew not through heroic resistance to oppression, but through the ordinary human processes of persuasion, community building, and cultural adaptation. Sometimes the truth is more inspiring than the myth. The early Christians who built their faith within Roman civilization, rather than in opposition to it, accomplished something remarkable through patience, organization, and peaceful conviction. Picture the iconic Roman soldier in your mind right now. He's carrying a short, straight sword, the gladius, that legendary blade that conquered the known world through superior Roman engineering and tactical brilliance. Except here's the thing that might gently blow your mind as you settle in tonight. The gladius wasn't Roman at all, it was Spanish. The Romans basically saw some Spanish warriors using these swords, thought that's pretty clever, and borrowed the design wholesale. This isn't just a minor footnote about metallurgy. It reveals something fundamental about how Roman civilization actually worked. We imagine Romans as these supremely innovative people who conquered through technological and tactical superiority. The reality is both more humble and more impressive. Romans were history's greatest cultural magpies, shamelessly borrowing the best ideas from everyone they encountered and improving them through systematic application. The gladius hispaniensis, literally Spanish sword, originated among Celtic and Iberian warriors in what's now Spain. When Roman armies first encountered these weapons during their Spanish campaigns in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, they immediately recognized their advantages over traditional Roman swords. The gladius was shorter than most contemporary weapons, making it perfect for close-quarters combat, especially in the tight formations that Romans preferred. Roman pragmatism is actually more admirable than Roman innovation. When you think about it, a less successful civilization might have insisted on using traditional weapons out of pride or cultural conservatism. Romans looked at what worked, adopted it, and then spent generations perfecting the training and tactics to maximize its effectiveness. The same pattern appears throughout Roman military technology. Roman artillery was largely based on Greek designs. Roman siege tactics borrowed heavily from Hellenistic practices. Even the famous testudo tortoise formation, where soldiers locked shields above and around them, was adapted from earlier Mediterranean military traditions. What made Romans exceptional wasn't that they invented these things, but that they systematized them. They developed standardized training methods, established supply chains to produce equipment at scale, and created institutional knowledge that could be passed from generation to generation of soldiers. A Roman legionnaire in Britain used essentially the same sword, received similar training, and fought in formations nearly identical to those used by his counterpart in Syria. The gladius itself underwent continuous refinement throughout the Roman period. Archaeologists have identified several distinct patterns, each representing improvements based on battlefield experience. The Mainz pattern was longer and more pointed, better for thrusting. The Fulham pattern was shorter and broader, optimized for cutting. The Pompeii pattern, ironically named since it was probably developed after Pompeii's destruction, represented the final evolution of the design. But here's what's really fascinating about Roman military borrowing. They didn't just copy weapons, they copied entire tactical systems, and then adapted them to Roman organizational culture. The gladius worked so well for Romans, not just because it was a good sword, but because it fit perfectly with their approach to military discipline, unit cohesion, and standardized training. Spanish warriors might use the gladius as individual fighters, relying on personal skill and courage. Romans turned it into part of an integrated system, where individual excellence mattered less than unit coordination. The sword became one element in a carefully orchestrated approach to warfare that included specific shield techniques, formation drills, and tactical doctrines. This systematic approach extended to sword training itself. Roman gladiator schools, which were essentially research and development centers for combat techniques, experimented with different fighting styles and weapons. Successful innovations from gladiatorial training often found their way into military curricula. The Romans basically turned warfare into a science, with continuous testing and refinement. The construction and maintenance of gladii also reveals Roman organizational genius. Archaeological evidence suggests that Roman armories could produce standardized weapons at remarkable scale. A single workshop might produce hundreds of nearly identical swords, each meeting specific weight, balance, and metallurgical standards. This wasn't just craft production, it was early mass manufacturing. Quality control was equally impressive. Military inspectors tested weapons for blade flexibility, point strength, and edge retention. Defective swords were rejected or reworked. Roman soldiers could trust that their equipment met consistent standards, regardless of where or when it was manufactured. The symbolic importance of the gladius in Roman culture is also worth considering as you drift off tonight. The sword wasn't just a tool, it became a representation of Roman military virtue. Soldiers swore oaths on their weapons. The gladius appeared in religious ceremonies and funeral rituals. When Romans wanted to represent military courage or imperial power, they depicted the gladius. Yet even this symbolism was borrowed and adapted. The Spanish warriors who originated the gladius design probably had their own ritual and symbolic uses for these weapons. Romans took those elements and incorporated them into Roman religious and cultural contexts, creating new meanings while preserving effective practices. Modern weapon historians have tested gladius replicas against other ancient sword designs, and the Spanish innovation remains impressive even by contemporary standards. The blade geometry optimizes both cutting and thrusting capabilities, The weight distribution provides excellent balance for extended combat. The handle design minimizes hand fatigue while maximizing grip security. But what Roman armies added to this excellent Spanish design was systematic deployment. While individual Spanish warriors might carry superior weapons, Roman legions could field thousands of soldiers with identical equipment, identical training, and coordinated tactics. The combination of borrowed technology with Roman organizational culture created a military advantage that lasted for centuries. The next time someone confidently explains how Roman military superiority came from superior Roman weapons technology, you can share this more nuanced story. Romans succeeded not because they invented better swords, but because they were humble enough to learn from others, and systematic enough to implement those lessons at massive scale. As you settle into sleep, imagine those Roman quartermasters traveling across the empire, constantly looking for better armor designs, improved tactics, more effective weapons, always willing to learn, always ready to adapt. It's actually a more admirable approach to innovation than trying to invent everything from scratch. Here's a delightful culinary confusion to ponder as you get comfortable. The Caesar salad, named after Julius Caesar, that most Roman of dishes, featuring the kind of simple, rustic ingredients that Roman soldiers might have enjoyed during their campaigns across Gaul. Except, and you probably see this coming, Caesar salad was invented in Tijuana, Mexico in the 1920s by an Italian immigrant named Caesar Cardini, and it has absolutely nothing to do with ancient Rome. This might seem like a trivial example of historical confusion, but it perfectly illustrates how we project our assumptions about the past onto the present. We want our historical figures to be connected to familiar things in our modern world, so we create these imaginary links between ancient Rome and contemporary culture. The real story of Caesar salad is actually more interesting than the mythical Roman connection. Caesar Cardini owned a restaurant called Hotel Caesar in Tijuana, right across the border from San Diego. During Prohibition, Americans would cross into Mexico for drinks and dining. According to food historians, Cardini invented his signature salad in 1924 when he was running low on kitchen ingredients and had to improvise a dish from what he had available: romaine lettuce, olive oil, lemon juice, Worcestershire sauce, garlic, Parmesan cheese, and croutons. The dramatic tableside preparation, tossing the salad with raw egg and anchovy paste while guests watched, was pure showmanship, designed to make simple ingredients seem sophisticated and special. It worked. The salad became popular with Hollywood celebrities and wealthy Americans who could afford border dining during the Depression. But this brings us to an interesting question. What did Romans actually eat? And how different was their cuisine from our expectations? The answer might surprise you as you drift into sleep tonight. Roman cuisine was simultaneously more sophisticated and more limited than popular imagination suggests. Wealthy Romans had access to ingredients from across the Mediterranean and beyond. Spices from India, Silk Road luxuries, preserved fish from Spain, wine from France, but they lacked many things we consider basic: tomatoes, potatoes, corn, chocolate, coffee, tea, sugar, as we know it, and most of the vegetables that define modern Italian cuisine. No tomatoes means no tomato-based sauces. No potatoes means no gnocchi or many other traditional Italian preparations. No corn means no polenta. When we picture Roman feasts, we often imagine something like modern Italian food, but actual Roman cuisine would seem quite foreign to contemporary palates. Romans were obsessed with a fermented fish sauce called garum, made from fish entrails, left to rot in the sun for several months. This was their ketchup, their soy sauce, their universal flavor enhancer. They put it on everything: meat, vegetables, bread, even mixed it with wine as a beverage. Archaeological evidence suggests garum production was a major industry throughout the Mediterranean. The flavor profile would have been intensely salty, funky, and umami-rich, similar to modern Asian fish sauces but probably much stronger. Romans also loved another fermented fish product called liquamen, which was slightly less pungent but still quite intense by modern standards. These weren't occasional condiments, they were daily staples. Roman attitudes toward food also differed significantly from ours. They believed that certain foods had medicinal properties, not in the modern nutritional sense but based on ancient theories about bodily humors and balance. They thought different foods could make you warmer or cooler, more or less passionate, intellectually sharper or duller. Honey was their primary sweetener, and they used it liberally in both sweet and savory preparations. Roman recipes often combined honey with wine, vinegar, and herbs in ways that would seem bizarre to modern palates. They made a popular beverage called mulsum from wine and honey, often flavored with spices or herbs. The famous Roman banquets that feature in movies and novels did exist, but they were special occasions, not daily dining. Most Romans, even relatively wealthy ones, ate fairly simple meals. Breakfast might be bread with olive oil, cheese, or honey. Lunch was often just bread and wine. The main meal came in the late afternoon or early evening. Dining customs were elaborate among the upper classes. The physical arrangement of couches, the order of service, even the topics of conversation were governed by social protocols. But the food itself, while often expensive and elaborate, was based on a relatively limited range of ingredients compared to what we have available today. Romans did innovate in food preservation and preparation. They developed sophisticated techniques for curing meats, preserving vegetables, and aging cheeses. Roman soldiers carried hardtack-style bread that could last for months. They created portable, concentrated foods that allowed armies to campaign far from supply bases. The spice trade was enormously important to Roman cuisine. Black pepper was so valuable, it was sometimes used as currency. Silphium, an extinct plant from North Africa, was worth its weight in gold, and appears frequently in Roman recipes. When the plant was harvested to extinction, it represented a genuine culinary catastrophe for wealthy Romans. Roman cooking techniques were also quite sophisticated. They used lead-lined pots for certain preparations, which we now know was poisonous but which they believed improved flavor. They had early versions of pressure cooking, slow roasting, and even a kind of primitive refrigeration using snow and ice in mountainous regions. The social aspects of Roman dining were perhaps more important than the food itself. Meals were opportunities for business negotiations, political discussions, and social networking. The guest list, seating arrangements, and quality of service sent messages about status, relationships, and ambitions. So the next time you order a Caesar salad, remember that you're enjoying a 1920s Mexican-Italian creation that has nothing to do with ancient Rome. But also remember that actual Roman cuisine was far more complex and interesting than our simplified assumptions suggest. As you settle into sleep tonight, imagine those Roman dinner parties with their exotic fish sauces, honey-wine combinations, and elaborate social rituals. A cuisine that was sophisticated in its own way, even if it would seem completely foreign to modern tastes. Let's drift into perhaps the most persistent myth about Roman history, that the Roman Empire fell in 47-6 CE, when barbarian hordes overran a decadent, weakened civilization. This dramatic narrative of rise and fall makes for compelling storytelling, but it fundamentally misunderstands how the Roman Empire actually ended, or rather, how it transformed into something else entirely. Here's what might surprise you as you get comfortable tonight. In 47-6 CE, when the traditional fall of Rome supposedly occurred, the Roman Empire was still operating normally in Constantinople, ruling over vast territories in the eastern Mediterranean, conducting diplomacy with European kingdoms, and maintaining the same legal, administrative, and military systems it had used for centuries. The so-called fall was really just a political reorganization in Western Europe. What we call the Byzantine Empire was simply the Roman Empire, continuing under new circumstances. The Byzantines called themselves Romans, maintained Roman law, and considered their state the direct continuation of Augustus's empire. This Roman Empire didn't actually end until 1453, when Constantinople fell to the Ottomans, nearly 1,000 years after the supposed fall of Rome. But even focusing on Western Europe, the story is much more complicated than barbarian conquest. The transformation of Roman administration into early medieval kingdoms was often gradual, negotiated, and surprisingly peaceful. Many so-called barbarian leaders were actually Roman officials who had been granted authority over specific territories and populations. The Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy, for example, maintained Roman law, Roman administrative structures, and Roman cultural institutions. Theodoric the Great, the Ostrogothic ruler, saw himself as ruling on behalf of the Roman Emperor in Constantinople. Roman senators continued to meet, Roman schools continued to operate, and Roman engineering projects continued under Gothic administration. This transformation had been happening for centuries before 47-6. Romans had been recruiting barbarian troops since the early empire. By the 4th century CE, many top Roman generals and officials were of Germanic, Hunnic, or other non-Roman origin. The boundaries between Roman and barbarian had become increasingly meaningless in practical terms. What we call the barbarian invasions were often more like managed migrations. Roman authorities frequently settled foreign tribes within imperial borders as foederati, allied peoples who provided military service in exchange for land and recognition. These weren't hostile conquests but negotiated arrangements that benefited both sides. The Visigoths in Spain, the Burgundians in Gaul, and the Vandals in North Africa all initially established their kingdoms with Roman approval and cooperation. Roman law continued to operate alongside Germanic legal codes. Latin remained the language of administration and culture. Christian bishops, many of whom were Roman educated, provided continuity in religious and intellectual life. Even the notorious sack of Rome by various barbarian armies, Alaric in 410, Genseric in 455, and others, were typically brief episodes that didn't fundamentally alter the city's character or population. Rome remained a major center of Christian culture, papal authority, and classical learning throughout the early medieval period. The real changes were more subtle and took place over generations. The Western Roman tax system gradually broke down, not because of barbarian destruction, but because of economic changes that made the old model unsustainable. Roman military recruitment shifted from citizen soldiers to professional armies that were increasingly indistinguishable from the Germanic warbands they were supposed to fight. Urban centers declined in many regions, but this was a complex process involving economic shifts, plague outbreaks, climate change, and political instability, not simply barbarian destruction. Many Roman cities evolved into medieval towns, maintaining continuity of population and culture even as political structures changed. The role of Christianity in this transformation is also misunderstood. Rather than being a cause of Roman decline, Christianity often provided the institutional continuity that preserved Roman culture and learning. Christian bishops became civic leaders, Christian monasteries preserved classical texts, and Christian schools maintained Roman educational traditions. What's particularly ironic is that many of the barbarian leaders who supposedly destroyed Roman civilization were themselves products of Roman education and culture. They spoke Latin, understood Roman law, and often tried to maintain Roman institutions in their new kingdoms. The persistence of the decline and fall narrative probably stems from Edward Gibbon's influential 18th century history, which presented Roman history as a moral tale about the dangers of luxury, Christianity, and military weakness. Gibbon's interpretation reflected the concerns of his own era, Enlightenment anxieties about religion, luxury, and imperial overstretch, more than actual Roman realities. Modern historians have largely abandoned Gibbon's framework in favor of more nuanced models of transformation, adaptation, and continuity. Rather than sudden collapse, they see a long process of political evolution that produced the medieval world while maintaining important elements of Roman civilization. Archaeological evidence supports this revisionist view. Recent excavations show that many barbarian settlements were remarkably Roman in character, with Roman-style buildings, Roman artifacts, and evidence of continued participation in Mediterranean trade networks. The material culture of daily life often changed very slowly, regardless of political boundaries. Language evolution tells a similar story. Latin didn't disappear when Roman political authority ended. It gradually evolved into the Romance languages. This process took centuries and happened through normal linguistic change, not catastrophic disruption. Italian, Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Romanian are all descendants of the Latin spoken in late Roman provinces. Legal traditions also show remarkable continuity. The Corpus Juris Civilis, compiled under Justinian in the 6th century, became the foundation for medieval and modern European legal systems. Roman law concepts continue to influence legal thinking today, transmitted through centuries of gradual adaptation rather than preserved despite collapse. As you drift off tonight, imagine instead of a dramatic fall, a slow transformation, Roman institutions gradually adapting to new circumstances, Roman culture blending with local traditions, Roman administrative techniques being adopted by new rulers who saw themselves as continuing rather than destroying an ancient civilization. Sometimes evolution is more impressive than revolution, and continuity more remarkable than dramatic change. Picture the classic Roman in your mind, draped in a flowing white toga, perhaps with a laurel wreath, looking dignified and senatorial as he strolls through marble halls. This image is so embedded in our collective imagination that toga party has become synonymous with ancient Roman culture. But here's the gentle revelation for tonight. Most Romans never wore togas. The garment was incredibly impractical for daily life, and the few who did wear them often found the experience profoundly annoying. Let that sink in as you get comfortable. The toga, that most Roman of garments, was actually a formal ceremonial outfit that most citizens encountered about as often as modern Americans wear tuxedos, which is to say, rarely, reluctantly, and with considerable complaint about the discomfort. The toga was a massive semicircular piece of wool cloth, roughly 18 feet long and 7 feet wide, that had to be wrapped around the body in a specific, complex way. There were no pins, clasps, or fasteners. The entire garment relied on careful draping and the wearer's ability to maintain proper posture. One wrong move and the whole thing could unravel, leaving you standing in public in just your tunic, feeling rather foolish. Roman writers frequently complained about togas. Martial, the satirical poet, grumbled about having to wear one to the morning salutation ritual, calling it uncomfortable and unnecessary. Juvenal mocked the pretensions of toga wearing, suggesting that most people who wore them were trying too hard to appear important. Even Cicero, that paragon of Roman dignity, occasionally complained about the practical difficulties of delivering speeches while managing several yards of unwieldy cloth. For daily wear, Romans preferred the tunic, a simple, practical garment similar to a long shirt or short dress. Tunics were comfortable, easy to put on, allowed freedom of movement, and could be made from different materials depending on the weather and the wearer's wealth. Working Romans, slaves, soldiers, merchants and artisans all wore tunics as their primary clothing. The toga was required for certain formal occasions, appearing in court, attending the Senate, participating in religious ceremonies, or conducting official business. It was essentially ancient Rome's version of formal business attire, just as modern professionals might wear suits to important meetings while preferring casual clothes for daily life. Romans wore togas when social or legal circumstances demanded them. Different types of togas conveyed different social messages. The toga virilis was the plain white toga, worn by adult male citizens. The toga praetexta, with its purple border, was reserved for magistrates and boys who hadn't yet reached adulthood. The toga picta, decorated with purple and gold, was worn by triumphant generals and later by emperors. The toga pulla, made of dark wool, was worn during mourning. Women generally didn't wear togas, except for prostitutes and women convicted of adultery, who were required to wear them as a mark of shame. Respectable Roman women wore the stola, a long dress-like garment, often with a palla cloak over it. The stola was more practical than the toga, and allowed for more varied styles and decorations. The complexity of toga wearing created an entire service industry. Wealthy Romans employed specialist slaves called vestiplici, whose job was to help with the complicated process of putting on formal clothing. These slaves were trained in the proper techniques for draping, folding, and arranging togas to achieve the correct look and ensure the garment stayed in place throughout the day. Regional variations also affected Roman clothing. In the colder northern provinces, Romans adapted their wardrobe to local conditions, wearing trousers, which they borrowed from Celtic and Germanic peoples, heavier cloaks, and more practical footwear. The toga remained a symbol of Roman citizenship, but it wasn't necessarily practical for daily life in Britain or Germany. Military dress was entirely different. Roman soldiers wore tunics, armor, and cloaks designed for functionality, rather than ceremonial appearance. The famous red military cloak, the sagum, was practical for campaign conditions and battlefield identification. Soldiers only wore togas during formal occasions in Rome itself, and probably weren't particularly enthusiastic about it. The evolution of Roman clothing also reflects broader cultural changes. During the early Republic, the toga was more common and less elaborate. As the empire grew wealthier and more cosmopolitan, clothing became more varied and influenced by foreign styles. Silk from China, cotton from India, and dyes from various provinces created new possibilities for Roman fashion. By the later empire, even formal occasions saw less rigid adherence to traditional toga requirements. The synthesis, a simpler garment that combined elements of Roman and Greek styles, became popular for formal dining and social occasions. It was essentially a compromise between traditional Roman dignity and practical comfort. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii and other sites shows the reality of Roman daily dress. Most preserved clothing fragments are from tunics, cloaks, and other practical garments. Toga remains are relatively rare, suggesting that even wealthy Romans didn't wear them frequently enough for the garments to survive in large numbers. The modern toga party tradition is actually based more on Greek Himation or Roman synthesis than on actual Roman togas. Using a bedsheet wrapped around the body creates something vaguely resembling ancient drapery, but it bears little relationship to the complex formal garment that actual Romans wore for ceremonial occasions. What's amusing is that Romans themselves probably would have found our casual approach to toga wearing rather shocking. The proper draping of a toga was a serious matter that conveyed social status, political authority, and cultural refinement. Wearing it incorrectly was a social embarrassment that could affect one's reputation and career prospects. As you settle into sleep tonight, imagine instead the reality of Roman daily life. People wearing comfortable tunics, complaining about having to dress up for formal occasions, and probably looking forward to getting home and changing into something more practical. The Romans were more like us than our mythology suggests, preferring comfort over ceremony in their daily clothing choices. Sometimes the most human details are the ones that get lost in grand historical narratives. Let's drift into one of history's most dramatic and persistent myths. Nero fiddling while Rome burned. Picture the scene that's been painted in countless books and movies. The mad emperor, resplendent in his palace, playing his violin with maniacal glee as flames consume his city below. It's the perfect symbol of imperial decadence and disconnection from reality. Except here's the thing that might gently surprise you tonight. Nero wasn't even in Rome when the fire started. Fiddles wouldn't be invented for another 1,000 years, and when he heard about the disaster, he rushed back to organize relief efforts. This story persists because it perfectly captures our assumptions about power corruption and imperial excess. We want our villains to be cartoonishly evil, our tyrants to be obviously depraved. The image of Nero fiddling while his city burns satisfies our need for clear moral narratives about the abuse of power. The reality was considerably more complex, and honestly more interesting. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE was indeed devastating. It burned for 6 days and destroyed much of the city. But contemporary sources suggest that Nero, who was in Antium, modern Anzio, when the fire began, immediately returned to Rome to coordinate emergency response efforts. According to Tacitus, who was no fan of Nero and had every reason to report imperial incompetence, the emperor opened his own palaces and public buildings to house displaced citizens. He organized food supplies for the homeless, reduced the price of grain, and brought in building materials from neighboring regions to begin reconstruction efforts. These aren't the actions of someone indifferent to his city's suffering. The fiddle anachronism is particularly revealing about how myths develop. The violin family of instruments didn't exist in ancient Rome. If Nero played anything during the fire, and there's no reliable evidence that he did, it would have been a lyre, a completely different type of instrument. But Nero playing the lyre while Rome burned doesn't have the same ring to it, does it? The confusion probably stems from the Roman word fidibus, which meant strings, and could refer to various stringed instruments. Over centuries of retelling, this became conflated with the much later fiddle, creating an impossible historical anachronism that nevertheless sounds more dramatic than the alternatives. What Nero actually did during and after the fire reveals both his genuine capabilities and his character flaws. The reconstruction of Rome was genuinely impressive. He implemented new building codes, requiring wider streets, fire-resistant materials, and better access to water supplies. The famous Domus Aurea, Golden House, that he built for himself was certainly extravagant, but it was part of a broader urban planning project that made Rome safer and more beautiful. However, Nero's handling of the political aftermath was less admirable. Facing rumors that he had started the fire himself to clear land for his building projects, he needed scapegoats. He blamed the Christians, a small, unpopular minority who made convenient targets. This led to some of the genuine persecutions that we discussed earlier. Christians were indeed executed in particularly gruesome ways as entertainment for Roman crowds seeking someone to blame for the disaster. The persistence of anti-Nero propaganda also reflects the political dynamics of the early empire. Nero was the last of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and his successors had every reason to blacken his reputation to justify their own rise to power. The Flavian emperors who followed, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, encouraged historians and writers to emphasize Nero's supposed madness and incompetence. But Nero was genuinely popular with ordinary Romans, especially in the eastern provinces. He reduced taxes, provided public entertainments, and generally avoided the kind of aristocratic hauteur that characterized many emperors. His artistic interests, which later historians mocked as frivolous, actually resonated with many subjects who appreciated having an emperor who valued culture and performance. The broader pattern here reveals something important about how historical villains are constructed. Nero certainly had serious character flaws. He was vain, paranoid, and capable of extreme cruelty, especially toward perceived rivals. He probably did kill his mother Agrippina, and he definitely executed his wife Octavia and his advisor Seneca. These were real crimes that deserve condemnation. But the specific stories that made Nero legendary, fiddling during the fire, general incompetence, complete disconnection from reality, were largely invented by his political enemies and embellished by later writers who needed dramatic examples of imperial excess. The actual Nero was more complex, politically astute in some ways, genuinely interested in arts and culture, popular with many of his subjects, but also ruthless and paranoid in his personal relationships. Archaeological evidence from Nero's building project supports this more nuanced view. The Domus Aurea was certainly extravagant, but it incorporated innovative architectural techniques and urban planning concepts that influenced Roman construction for centuries. The post-fire reconstruction of Rome created a city that was safer, more organized, and more beautiful than what had existed before. Even Nero's famous artistic pretensions weren't necessarily as ridiculous as later historians suggested. He was genuinely skilled at music and poetry, and his public performances were popular with audiences, even if they scandalized traditional aristocrats who thought emperors shouldn't perform in public. His cultural interest reflected broader changes in Roman society, where Greek artistic traditions were becoming increasingly influential. The suicide that ended Nero's reign was itself more complex than the standard narrative suggests. Facing a military rebellion, he fled Rome, but couldn't bring himself to take his own life immediately. His supposed last words, "What an artist dies in me," were probably invented by later writers, but they capture something real about his character. A man who saw himself as a creative genius, trapped in the role of political leader. As you drift off tonight, consider how this pattern applies to other historical villains and heroes, how much of what we know about famous figures reflects later political needs, cultural assumptions, and narrative convenience, rather than actual historical evidence. Sometimes the real person is more interesting than the legend, especially when, the legend serves our need for clear moral lessons. Truth, as usual, is more complex than fiction, but often more revealing about human nature. Here's a Roman achievement that everyone knows: the magnificent aqueducts that brought fresh water to cities across the empire. When we think of Roman engineering genius, we picture those massive stone arches marching across the countryside, a testament to Roman innovation and technical superiority. Except here's tonight's gentle revelation: the Romans didn't invent aqueducts, they weren't the first to build them. And some of the most impressive water management systems in the ancient world were built by civilizations the Romans considered barbarian. This doesn't diminish Roman achievements. It actually makes them more impressive. Rather than inventing water transport from scratch, Romans took existing technologies and scaled them up to unprecedented levels, creating water management systems of remarkable sophistication and longevity. The basic technology of moving water through constructed channels existed long before Rome. The Assyrians built aqueducts in the 8th century BCE. The Greeks had sophisticated water management systems, including the famous tunnel of Eupalinos on Samos, built in the 6th century BCE. The Persians developed qanats, underground water channels, that supplied cities across their empire. What made Roman aqueducts distinctive wasn't the basic concept, but the scale, standardization, and systematic approach to urban water supply. Romans built aqueduct systems that served populations in the hundreds of thousands, maintained precise praetions across hundreds of miles, and operated reliably for centuries. But as you settle in tonight, consider this interesting detail. Most Roman aqueducts were underground. The dramatic stone arches that appear in tourist photographs represent only the small portions where aqueducts needed to cross valleys or maintain proper elevation. The majority of Roman water systems consisted of buried pipes, covered channels, and tunneled sections that are far less photogenic than the surviving arch systems. The engineering challenges were genuinely impressive. Roman surveyors had to calculate gradients that would allow water to flow steadily without becoming stagnant or moving so fast that it damaged the channels. A typical Roman aqueduct dropped only a few feet per mile, requiring remarkable precision in construction across vast distances. The Aqua Claudia, one of Rome's major aqueducts, traveled 45 miles from its source to the city, dropping only 1,200 feet in elevation, an average gradient of less than. This required sophisticated surveying techniques and careful attention to topography, geology, and hydraulic engineering principles. Roman innovations were often in the details rather than the basic concepts. They developed standardized pipe sizes, connection methods, and distribution systems. They created settling tanks to allow sediment to precipitate out of the water supply. They built overflow systems to handle variations in water flow, and maintenance shutoffs to allow repairs without disrupting service to entire cities. The scale of Roman water management becomes clear when you consider that the city of Rome itself was supplied by 11 major aqueducts, delivering an estimated 350 million gallons per day. This provided roughly 40 to 80 gallons per person per day, comparable to water consumption in many modern cities, and far exceeding what was available in most European cities until the 19th century. But Roman aqueduct systems weren't just about quantity, they were about quality control and distribution equity. Roman water law was surprisingly sophisticated, with detailed regulations about water rights, maintenance responsibilities, and quality standards. The Curator Aquarum, the water commissioner, was one of the most important officials in Roman administration. Frontinus, who served as Curator Aquarum under the emperors Nerva and Trajan, wrote a detailed manual on Roman water management that survives today. His work reveals the complexity of the systems Romans built and maintained. He describes not just the engineering aspects, but the administrative challenges of preventing theft, maintaining quality, and ensuring equitable distribution. Water theft was apparently a constant problem. Private individuals would illegally tap into public water lines, or corrupt officials would grant unauthorized connections in exchange for bribes. Frontinus developed inspection systems and penalty structures to combat these problems, creating what was essentially the world's first water utility regulation system. The distribution networks within cities were equally sophisticated. Roman engineers developed multi-level systems that provided different water qualities for different uses. The highest quality water went to drinking fountains and private households. Medium quality water supplied public baths and latrines. Lower quality water was used for industrial purposes and street cleaning. This hierarchical distribution system required complex networks of pipes, valves, and storage facilities. Archaeological excavations have revealed Roman water systems with lead pipes, bronze fittings, and ceramic conduits that operated as integrated networks, serving entire urban populations. The social implications were equally impressive. Roman aqueducts made possible the public bath culture that was central to Roman social life. They enabled the elaborate fountain displays that decorated Roman cities. They allowed for the public latrines that, whatever we might think of their communal design, represented a significant advance in urban sanitation. But perhaps most remarkably, Roman water systems often operated for centuries with minimal maintenance. Some Roman aqueducts continued to supply medieval cities long after the fall of the Western Empire. The Aqua Virgo, built by Marcus Agrippa in 19 BCE, still supplies water to Rome's Trevi fountain today, more than 2,000 years after its construction. The longevity of Roman water systems reflects not just good initial engineering but sustainable design principles. Romans built systems that could be maintained and repaired by successive generations, using local materials and techniques that didn't require highly specialized knowledge to implement. Regional variations also reveal Roman adaptability. In desert regions, they built underground systems to minimize evaporation. In mountainous areas, they used natural springs and gravity-fed systems. In flat terrain, they sometimes used inverted siphon systems that could transport water uphill using hydraulic pressure. The decline of Roman aqueduct systems in Western Europe wasn't usually due to engineering failure, but to social and economic collapse. Maintaining these systems required organized administration, skilled workers, and tax revenue to fund operation. When Roman political structures collapsed, the knowledge and resources needed to maintain complex water systems often disappeared as well. As you drift off tonight, imagine the scale of coordination required to build and maintain these systems. Surveyors calculating grades across hundreds of miles, workers quarrying stone and laying pikes, administrators managing water rights and maintenance schedules, all working together to provide clean water to millions of people across 3 continents. Sometimes the most impressive human achievements are the ones that work so well we take them for granted. Let's drift into one of the most persistent myths about Roman government. That the Roman Republic was a democracy that provided inspiration for modern democratic institutions like the United States. This narrative is so embedded in Western political thought that American founding fathers consciously modeled aspects of the US Constitution on Roman precedents. And we still use Roman symbols like eagles and fasces in government buildings. But here's tonight's gentle reality check. The Roman Republic was an oligarchy that would be almost unrecognizable to anyone who believes in democratic principles. This isn't just a semantic argument about the definition of democracy. The Roman Republic was explicitly designed to prevent popular rule and maintain aristocratic control over government. The system worked brilliantly for several centuries. If you were a wealthy male citizen from an established family, for everyone else, it was elaborate political theater that provided the appearance of participation without meaningful power. Let's start with the basic numbers that reveal the Republic's true character. At its height, the Roman Empire included perhaps 50–60 million people. Of these, only about 4 to 6 million were citizens, and only adult males could participate in politics. But even among male citizens, political power was heavily weighted toward the wealthy and well-connected. The Roman voting system was designed to ensure that aristocratic minorities could outvote popular majorities. In the Comitia Centuriata, the main legislative assembly, votes were counted by centuries, military units that were organized by wealth. The richest citizens controlled 98 centuries, while the poorest controlled only 95. Since the first 98 centuries to vote constituted a majority, elections could technically be decided entirely by the wealthy, without the votes of ordinary citizens even being counted. The Comitia Tributa used a different system but achieved similar results. Votes were counted by tribes, geographic districts that were manipulated to ensure rural, aristocratic areas had disproportionate influence compared to urban centers where most ordinary citizens lived. It was gerrymandering on a massive scale, centuries before the term was invented. But the real power in the Roman Republic lay not in these assemblies but in the Senate, which was composed entirely of former magistrates from wealthy families. The Senate wasn't elected by popular vote. It was essentially a self-perpetuating aristocratic council that controlled foreign policy, finances, and, most important, government decisions. Access to high office required enormous personal wealth, since magistrates weren't paid and were expected to fund public works, games, and other expensive civic projects from their own resources. This created a system where only the independently wealthy could afford political careers, effectively excluding anyone from the middle or lower classes from real power. The Roman political system also included various mechanisms specifically designed to prevent popular leaders from gaining too much influence. The consulship was shared between two officials who could veto each other's actions. Terms of office were limited to 1 year for most positions. The tribunes of the plebs, who were supposed to represent common citizens, could be intimidated, bribed, or simply ignored by the aristocratic establishment. When popular leaders did emerge, the Gracchi brothers in the 2nd century BCE are the classic example. They were often assassinated or driven from office by aristocratic factions who viewed any appeal to ordinary citizens as dangerous demagogy. The Roman Republic had no constitutional protections for minority rights or individual liberties that might have constrained mob violence by the elite. The Roman legal system reflected these same class distinctions. There were different penalties for the same crimes depending on social status. A wealthy citizen might face exile for a crime that would result in death or slavery for someone of lower status. The entire legal framework assumed that society was naturally hierarchical and that different rules should apply to different classes. Roman citizenship itself was carefully restricted and stratified. Full citizenship was limited to free-born males of Roman or Latin background. Women, slaves, and foreigners were excluded entirely. Even among male citizens, there were various gradations. Some could vote, but not hold office. Others could participate in certain assemblies, but not others. The expansion of Roman territory made the republican system even less democratic in practice. Citizens living in distant provinces couldn't travel to Rome to participate in government, so political participation became limited to residents of central Italy and the wealthy few who could afford to maintain houses in the capital. What's particularly interesting is how Roman authors themselves described their system. They didn't use the word democracy, demokratia in Greek, as a compliment. To most Roman political thinkers, democracy meant mob rule, the dangerous situation where the uneducated masses might make irrational decisions that threatened property rights and social stability. Instead, Romans praised their system as a mixed constitution that balanced different elements: monarchical consuls, aristocratic senate, and popular assemblies, to prevent any single group from gaining too much power. This was explicitly designed to prevent democracy, not to achieve it. The American founders who looked to Rome for inspiration were well aware of these limitations. They admired Roman institutions not because they were democratic, but because they provided stability, expansion, and prosperity for several centuries, while maintaining elite control. The complex system of checks and balances in the US Constitution reflects Roman influences, but it was designed to create a more democratic system than Rome ever achieved. Even Roman writers acknowledged the contradictions in their system. Cicero, the Republic's greatest defender, admitted that the system often failed to represent the interests of ordinary citizens, and that corruption was endemic. His political writings are full of complaints about aristocrats who bought elections, intimidated opponents, and ignored the public good in favor of personal advantage. The transformation of the Republic into the Empire wasn't really a rejection of democratic principles. It was the logical conclusion of a system that had always been oligarchic. Augustus and his successors simply made explicit the imperial power that had already been concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy families. As you settle into sleep tonight, consider how this pattern might apply to other political systems that claim democratic legitimacy while maintaining elite control. Sometimes the most important political lessons come from understanding how power actually operates rather than how it's officially supposed to work. The Romans built a remarkably successful political system, but it succeeded by limiting democracy, not by embracing it. Here's perhaps the most uncomfortable myth we need to address as you settle in tonight. The assumption that Roman slavery was a uniform system of oppression that we can easily understand through comparison with other historical examples, particularly American plantation slavery. This oversimplification obscures both the genuine horrors of Roman slavery and its complex social dynamics that don't fit our modern categories of free and unfree labor. Roman slavery was simultaneously more brutal and more fluid than popular imagination suggests. The system included everything from elite Greek tutors who lived comfortable lives and influenced powerful families, to agricultural slaves who died in chains after lives of unimaginable hardship. Understanding this complexity doesn't excuse the institution, but it helps explain how a slave-based society could function for centuries and why slavery was so deeply embedded in Roman culture. The scale alone was staggering. Modern estimates suggest that 20–30% of the Roman Empire's population were slaves, perhaps 10 to 15 million people at the system's height. This wasn't a marginal institution, but the foundation of Roman economic and social life. Slavery wasn't just about agricultural labor. Slaves worked as doctors, teachers, accountants, artists, engineers, and in virtually every other profession. What makes Roman slavery particularly complex is that it wasn't racially based. Romans enslaved anyone they could capture or purchase, regardless of ethnicity. Greek slaves were often more educated than their Roman masters. Germanic slaves might be valued for their physical strength. Jewish slaves brought specialized knowledge of finance and trade. Celtic slaves were prized for their craftsmanship skills. This ethnic diversity meant that slavery couldn't be justified through theories of racial inferiority that would later characterize other slave systems. Instead, Romans viewed slavery as a consequence of military defeat, economic misfortune, or birth circumstances, unfortunate but not necessarily permanent conditions. The possibility of manumission, legal freedom, was real and relatively common in Roman society. Masters freed slaves for various reasons: reward for loyal service, payment of a purchase price, as a gesture of generosity, or as part of a will. Freed slaves became Roman citizens, though with some legal restrictions, and their children were full citizens indistinguishable from any other Romans. This created a significant population of freedmen who often maintained close relationships with their former masters' families. Some freedmen became extremely wealthy and influential. Trimalchio, the fictional freedman in Petronius's Satyricon, was a comic exaggeration, but he was based on real social types, former slaves who had achieved prosperity and social prominence. The patron-client relationship between former masters and freed slaves was legally recognized and socially important. Freedmen owed certain obligations to their former masters, but also received protection and support. This created networks of mutual obligation that could span generations and influenced Roman politics, business, and social life. But this potential for advancement coexisted with extreme brutality towards slaves who were considered dangerous, rebellious, or simply unlucky. Agricultural slaves, especially those working in large-scale operations like mines or latifundia, lived in conditions of systematic cruelty. They were worked to death, housed in underground barracks, and treated as replaceable equipment. The crucifixion of 6,000 slaves after Spartacus's rebellion wasn't unusual punishment. It was standard procedure for dealing with slave revolts. Roman law permitted masters to kill slaves for almost any reason, and required all slaves in a household to be executed if one slave killed the master. These weren't aberrations but legal principles that reflected how thoroughly dehumanized slaves could be under Roman law. Sexual exploitation was endemic and legally sanctioned. Masters had complete sexual access to their slaves of any age or gender. This wasn't considered adultery, rape, or abuse. It was simply the exercise of property rights. The psychological and physical trauma this caused was immense. But Roman law and culture provided no protection or recognition of slaves' humanity in this regard. The economic logic of Roman slavery was different from later plantation systems. Roman slave owners often found it more profitable to work slaves to death and purchase replacements than to invest in their long-term health and productivity. The constant supply of prisoners from military campaigns and the extensive slave trade made replacement cheaper than maintenance in many contexts. Regional variations were significant. Urban household slaves generally lived better than rural, agricultural slaves. Skilled slaves enjoyed more privileges than unskilled laborers. Imperial slaves, those owned by the emperor, often held positions of considerable responsibility and influence. But these variations in treatment didn't change the fundamental legal reality that slaves were property without rights. The integration of slavery into Roman family life created complex emotional dynamics. Slave nurses raised Roman children, slave tutors provided their education, and slave servants managed household affairs. Some of these relationships involved genuine affection and loyalty, but they always existed within a framework where one person legally owned another. Roman attitudes towards slavery were shaped by their understanding of natural hierarchy and social order. They believed that some people were naturally suited to command and others to obey, that civilization required the subordination of the less capable to the more capable, and that slavery was therefore a natural and necessary institution. But Romans also recognized the potential for slaves to possess talents and virtues that exceeded those of their masters. The Stoic philosophy that influenced many educated Romans acknowledged that true freedom was internal, and that a wise slave might be morally superior to a foolish master. This created intellectual tensions that Roman thinkers never fully resolved. The decline of Roman slavery was gradual and driven by economic rather than moral factors. As the empire stopped expanding, the supply of new slaves decreased. The cost of maintaining large slave populations increased while their productivity remained limited. In many regions, forms of tenant farming and wage labor became more efficient than slave-based agriculture. Christianity's relationship with slavery was also complex. Early Christian communities included both slaves and masters, and Christian writers generally accepted slavery as a social reality while emphasizing spiritual equality. The gradual Christianization of the Roman Empire may have influenced some improvements in slave treatment, but it didn't challenge the institution directly. As you drift off tonight, consider how this complexity applies to other historical injustices. Understanding the full reality of systems like Roman slavery, their internal contradictions, their cultural justifications, their economic logic, helps us recognize similar patterns in other times and places. Sometimes the most important historical lessons come from grappling with uncomfortable complexities rather than seeking simple moral clarity. Let's settle into one of the most persistent myths about Roman achievement: that Roman engineering was superior to anything that came before or after, representing a pinnacle of ancient technology that wasn't matched again until the modern era. This narrative appears everywhere. Documentaries praising Roman concrete, textbooks marveling at Roman roads, tourist guides explaining how Roman buildings have lasted for millennia. But here's tonight's gentle correction. Roman engineering was often impressive but rarely revolutionary, and much of what we attribute to Roman genius was borrowed, adapted, or paralleled by other civilizations. This doesn't diminish legitimate Roman achievements, but it places them in proper historical context. Romans were excellent engineers, but their greatness lay more in systematic application and large-scale implementation than in fundamental innovation. Take Roman concrete. probably the most celebrated example of Roman engineering superiority. The addition of volcanic ash, pozzolan to lime mortar created a hydraulic cement that could set underwater and became stronger with age. This was genuinely impressive technology that enabled the construction of massive domed structures like the Pantheon. But here's what often gets overlooked. The basic principles of lime mortar were known throughout the Mediterranean for centuries before Rome. The specific innovation of adding volcanic ash was probably discovered by Greek or Etruscan builders working in volcanic regions of Italy. Romans systematized its production and used it at unprecedented scale, but they didn't invent the underlying chemistry. Moreover, Roman concrete had significant limitations that are often ignored in popular accounts. It required specific volcanic materials that weren't available everywhere, limiting its use to certain regions. The concrete was strong in compression but weak in tension, requiring careful architectural design to avoid structural failure. And while some Roman concrete structures have lasted millennia, many others collapsed or deteriorated within decades of construction. The famous Roman roads present a similar story of overstated innovation. Roman road building was certainly systematic and extensive. The empire eventually included over 250,000 miles of roads connecting all major population centers. But the basic techniques of road construction were known to earlier civilizations. The Persians built extensive road networks with way stations, maintenance systems, and standardized construction techniques. The Chinese were building sophisticated roads during the same period as Roman expansion. Even Celtic peoples in Britain and Gaul had developed road-building techniques adapted to local conditions. What made Roman roads distinctive was their standardization and integration into an empire-wide system. Roman engineers developed consistent specifications for road width, surface materials, and drainage that could be applied across diverse terrain and climate conditions. But individual Roman roads weren't necessarily better built than comparable roads constructed by other civilizations. Roman architectural achievements follow similar patterns. The arch and dome construction that enabled buildings like the Colosseum and Pantheon were based on techniques developed earlier by Etruscan and Greek builders. Romans certainly perfected these methods and applied them at massive scale, but the underlying structural principles weren't Roman innovations. The Pantheon's dome, while genuinely impressive, wasn't the largest dome in the ancient world. The Hagia Sophia, built by Byzantine engineers in the 6th century CE, had a larger dome that was arguably more technically sophisticated. Earlier civilizations built impressive domed structures using different techniques. The treasury of Atreus in Greece, for example, dates to the 13th century BC. Roman water management systems, which we discussed earlier, followed the same pattern. While Roman aqueducts were extensive and well built, the underlying technologies were developed by earlier civilizations. The Assyrians, Babylonians, and Persians all built sophisticated water transport systems. The qanat systems of ancient Persia were in some ways more technically sophisticated than Roman aqueducts, using underground channels that minimized evaporation and could operate in desert conditions where Roman techniques would fail. Roman military engineering was undoubtedly effective, but it was also largely derivative. Roman siege techniques borrowed heavily from Hellenistic practices. Roman artillery was based on Greek designs. Even Roman military architecture, the famous castra fortified camps that Roman armies built each night, followed principles that can be traced back to earlier Mediterranean military traditions. What Romans excelled at was logistics, standardization, and systematic implementation. They developed procedures that allowed large numbers of soldiers to quickly build standardized fortifications using local materials. They created supply systems that could maintain armies far from Roman territory for extended periods. They established training programs that could teach consistent techniques to recruits from diverse backgrounds. The same pattern appears in Roman urban planning. Cities like Timgad in North Africa or Caerleon in Wales demonstrate impressive organization and engineering competence. But the grid street patterns, public facilities, and infrastructure systems were based on Greek and Hellenistic models. Romans applied these urban design principles systematically across their empire, but they didn't invent them. Regional variations also reveal the limitations of Roman engineering orthodoxy. In desert regions, local building techniques often proved more suitable than Roman methods. In Northern Europe, Local materials and climate conditions required adaptations that departed significantly from standard Roman practices. Some of the most successful Roman construction projects were those that incorporated local knowledge and techniques, rather than rigidly applying Roman standards. The survival of Roman structures also reflects factors beyond engineering excellence. Many Roman buildings survived because they were continuously maintained and adapted by successive civilizations who found them useful. The Pantheon survives partly because it was converted into a church, ensuring ongoing maintenance for nearly 2,000 years. Roman roads survived where they continued to serve important transportation routes, but disappeared where economic and political changes made them obsolete. Archaeological evidence suggests that Roman engineering failure was more common than popular accounts acknowledge. Roman bridges collapsed, Roman buildings fell down, and Roman infrastructure systems failed due to poor design, inadequate maintenance, or environmental factors. We remember the successes because they survived. The failures disappeared from the archaeological record. The mythology of Roman engineering superiority probably serves several cultural functions. It provides a narrative of Western technological progress that links modern achievements to classical antiquity. It suggests that impressive engineering requires the kind of centralized authority and systematic organization that characterizes modern nation-states, and it offers reassuring evidence that human technical capabilities can overcome natural limitations. As you drift off tonight, consider how this pattern might apply to other technological narratives. Sometimes the most impressive human achievements involve not dramatic innovation, but patient improvement, systematic application, and the wisdom to adopt good ideas regardless of their origin. Roman engineers succeeded not because they were more brilliant than their predecessors, but because they were humble enough to learn from everyone they encountered. Here's a final myth to ponder as you prepare for sleep: that Latin died with the Roman Empire and was somehow revived during the Renaissance by scholars who rediscovered classical texts. This narrative appears in countless history books. Latin as a dead language that survived only in scholarly manuscripts until humanist scholars brought it back to life for scientific and intellectual discourse. The reality is far more interesting and reveals fundamental misunderstandings about how languages actually work. Latin never died. It evolved continuously from the Roman period through the Middle Ages and into the modern era, transforming into the Romance languages we know today, while simultaneously continuing as a learned language for intellectual, religious, and administrative purposes. Let that sink in as you get comfortable tonight. When we speak of Latin as a dead language, we're using a technical term that obscures the living reality of linguistic evolution. Latin didn't die. It grew up, had children, and transformed into Italian, Spanish, French, Portuguese, Romanian, and dozens of other languages and dialects. The Latin spoken by Roman soldiers in Gaul gradually became French. The Latin used by settlers in Hispania evolved into Spanish and Portuguese. The Latin of Roman colonists in Dacia developed into Romanian. This wasn't replacement or revival. It was natural linguistic change, happening over centuries through normal processes of pronunciation shift, grammatical simplification, and vocabulary borrowing. Medieval Latin presents an even more complex picture. Throughout the Middle Ages, Latin remained the primary language of education, law, diplomacy, and scholarship across Western Europe. Medieval universities conducted all instruction in Latin. International treaties were written in Latin. Scientific and philosophical works were composed in Latin. The Catholic Church used Latin for liturgy and theological writing. This medieval Latin wasn't a fossilized version of Cicero's prose. It was a living, evolving language that developed new vocabulary, grammatical constructions, and stylistic conventions to meet contemporary needs. Medieval writers created Latin terms for new technologies, philosophical concepts, and social institutions that didn't exist in classical antiquity. Medieval Latin also showed significant regional variations. The Latin written in 12th century England differed in vocabulary and style from contemporary Latin in France, Germany, or Italy. Local languages influenced pronunciation, word choice, and sentence structure, creating distinctive regional varieties of learned Latin. The supposedly pure classical Latin that Renaissance humanists sought to restore was itself artificial. Cicero's elaborate prose style was formal literary language, even in his own time, quite different from the everyday Latin actually spoken by ordinary Romans. The classical authors that humanists admired represented elite literary culture, not natural speech patterns. What Renaissance scholars actually accomplished was not the revival of a dead language, but the standardization of a living one. They established classical authors as stylistic models, created more systematic approaches to Latin grammar and vocabulary, and used printing technology to spread standardized texts more widely than had been possible with manuscript transmission. But even during the supposed classical revival, Latin continued to evolve and adapt to new circumstances. Scientific Latin of the 16th and 17th centuries developed extensive new vocabulary for anatomy, astronomy, botany, and other fields that ancient Romans never studied systematically. Legal Latin incorporated concepts from medieval and modern jurisprudence that had no classical precedents. The relationship between Latin and vernacular languages was also more complex than simple replacement narratives suggest. Throughout the medieval and early modern periods, educated Europeans routinely used both Latin and their native languages, often in the same document or conversation. Code switching between Latin and vernacular was normal and functional, not a sign of linguistic confusion. Latin's role in scientific and scholarly communication persisted well into the modern era for practical rather than antiquarian reasons. The scientific work published in Latin could be read by scholars across Europe, regardless of their native languages. Latin provided a common intellectual vocabulary that facilitated international scholarly communication in ways that vernacular languages couldn't match. Carl Linnaeus published his revolutionary biological classification system in Latin in 1753. Isaac Newton wrote his Principia in Latin in 1687. As late as the 19th century, many scholarly works appeared first in Latin and were only later translated into vernacular languages. This wasn't nostalgia for classical antiquity. It was practical recognition that Latin remained the most efficient language for certain types of intellectual communication. The decline of Latin as a living scholarly language was gradual and uneven. In some fields like medicine and law, Latin terminology remained standard long after Latin ceased to be used for general scholarly writing. Modern medical and legal vocabulary still includes hundreds of Latin terms that professionals use daily without thinking of them as dead language artifacts. Even today, Latin hasn't completely disappeared as a living language. The Vatican continues to use Latin for official documents and conducts some business in Latin. Catholic liturgy worldwide includes Latin elements. Legal systems throughout the world use Latin terms and phrases as part of normal professional practice. The persistence of Latin in education also reflects its continued vitality as an intellectual tool. Students who learn Latin aren't just studying ancient literature. They're gaining access to linguistic structures that influence modern European languages, developing analytical skills that transfer to other subjects, and participating in intellectual traditions that span more than 2 millennia. What's particularly interesting is how the dead language myth obscures Latin's influence on contemporary culture. English includes thousands of Latin-derived words, many of which entered the language during the medieval and early modern periods when Latin was supposedly dead. Modern scientific and technical vocabulary continues to create new terms from Latin roots, suggesting that the language remains productive even in supposedly non-Latin linguistic environments. The Roman Catholic Church's decision to conduct the Second Vatican Council, partly in Latin during the 1960s, wasn't antiquarianism. It reflected the practical reality that Latin remained the most efficient common language for international church communication. Bishops from around the world could participate in theological discussions using a shared vocabulary that transcended national and cultural boundaries. As you drift into sleep tonight, consider how this pattern of linguistic continuity and adaptation applies to other aspects of cultural transmission. Languages, like civilizations, rarely die sudden deaths. They transform, adapt, and continue in new forms that maintain connections to their origins, while serving contemporary needs. Sometimes what we call death is actually transformation, and what we call revival is simply recognition of what never actually disappeared. Let's end our journey through Roman myths with perhaps the most fundamental misconception of all: the assumption that Romans represented civilization, while everyone else represented barbarism. This binary view of the ancient world, civilized Romans versus barbarian tribes, underlies most popular narratives about Roman history and shapes how we understand the relationship between empire and cultural development. But here's the final revelation to carry into sleep. The people Romans called barbarians often had more sophisticated technologies, more equitable social systems, and more sustainable economic practices than the Romans themselves. The collision between Roman and barbarian cultures wasn't civilization meeting savagery. It was one complex civilization encountering others with different values, priorities, and solutions to human problems. The word barbarian itself reveals Roman cultural prejudices rather than objective reality. To Romans, anyone who didn't speak Greek or Latin was a barbarian. The word comes from the Greek barbaros, meaning someone whose speech sounds like bar 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 to Greek ears. It was essentially ancient linguistic chauvinism, assuming that people who spoke differently must also think differently and live less sophisticated lives. Celtic societies, which Romans encountered throughout Gaul, Britain, and Central Europe, had developed remarkable metallurgical technologies. Celtic smiths produced steel that was superior to Roman metalwork in many applications. They created intricate jewelry, weapons, and tools, using techniques that impressed even Roman observers. Celtic artists developed distinctive styles that influenced Roman decorative arts and continued to evolve throughout the medieval period. Celtic legal and social systems were also sophisticated, though organized according to different principles than Roman law. Celtic societies often had more gender equality than Rome. Women could own property, initiate divorce, and sometimes hold positions of political authority that were impossible under Roman law. The legendary Queen Boudica wasn't an anomaly, but an example of leadership roles available to women in Celtic societies. Germanic tribes that Romans fought along the Rhine and Danube frontiers had developed agricultural techniques well suited to northern European conditions. They practiced crop rotation, forest management, and animal husbandry that allowed sustainable settlement in regions where Roman agricultural methods often failed. Their building techniques using timber and thatch were better adapted to local climate and materials than Roman stone construction. Germanic legal traditions emphasized community decision-making and restorative justice in ways that differed significantly from Roman approaches. While Roman law focused on punishment and hierarchy, Germanic legal codes often sought to restore social harmony through compensation and community involvement. These traditions influenced medieval European law and continue to influence modern legal thinking about alternative dispute resolution. The Dacians, whom Trajan conquered in 2 bloody wars, had developed sophisticated engineering and mining techniques. Dacian gold mines used hydraulic technology that allowed extraction from locations that would have been impossible with simpler methods. Dacian fortifications incorporated architectural innovations that Romans later adopted for their own military construction. Persian and Mesopotamian civilizations that Romans encountered in the East had mathematical, astronomical, and medical knowledge that surpassed Roman achievements in many fields. Persian administrative systems managed diverse populations across vast territories using techniques that influenced later Roman imperial administration. Persian religious and philosophical traditions contributed to intellectual developments throughout the Roman world. Even the Gallic warriors that Julius Caesar famously conquered had military technologies and tactics that challenged Roman assumptions about warfare. Celtic cavalry techniques were superior to Roman methods. Celtic siege warfare incorporated innovations that Romans eventually adopted. The famous Gallic wars that made Caesar's reputation were hard-fought campaigns against skilled opponents, not easy victories over primitive tribes. What made Roman expansion successful wasn't technological or cultural superiority, but specific advantages in organization, logistics, and political integration. Romans developed systems for incorporating conquered peoples, but often preserved local institutions while extracting resources and manpower for further expansion. This was pragmatic imperial management, not evidence of inherent civilization. Roman authors themselves often acknowledged the achievements of peoples they conquered. Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic Wars described Celtic societies with considerable respect, noting their skills in metalwork, their complex political organizations, and their military capabilities. Tacitus wrote admiringly about Germanic social institutions, sometimes contrasting Germanic virtue with Roman decadence. The integration of barbarian knowledge into Roman civilization was extensive and continuous. Roman military technology incorporated innovations from Celtic, Germanic, Persian, and other sources. Roman art and architecture showed influences from across the empire. Roman religious practices absorbed elements from dozens of local traditions. Some of the most successful Roman emperors were of barbarian origin. Trajan was Spanish, Septimius Severus was African, Constantine was from the Balkans. These weren't exceptions, but examples of how Roman imperial culture drew talent and leadership from throughout the empire, regardless of ethnic origin. The economic relationships between Romans and barbarians were also more complex than simple exploitation. Trade networks connected Roman cities with communities far beyond imperial borders. Archaeological evidence shows Roman goods in Scandinavia, German amber in Roman jewelry, and Chinese silk in Roman clothing. These weren't one-sided extractions, but mutually beneficial commercial relationships. Environmental factors also challenge assumptions about Roman superiority. Many barbarian societies developed more sustainable relationships with their local ecosystems than Roman methods allowed. Celtic and Germanic agricultural practices often maintained soil fertility better than Roman intensive farming. Northern European building techniques used renewable materials more efficiently than Roman stone construction. The decline of Roman political authority in Western Europe didn't represent the triumph of barbarism over civilization. It represented the emergence of new political and cultural arrangements that combined Roman, Germanic, Celtic, and other traditions into synthetic medieval European civilization. Modern archaeological discoveries continue to reveal the sophistication of pre-Roman and non-Roman European societies. Recent excavations have uncovered Celtic oppida, fortified towns, with complex urban planning, extensive trade networks, and sophisticated craft production. Germanic settlements show evidence of literacy, artistic achievement, and technological innovation that challenges traditional narratives about barbarian simplicity. The persistence of the civilization versus barbarism narrative probably reflects modern cultural anxieties more than ancient realities. We want to believe that our own civilization represents progress over earlier forms of human organization, so we project similar assumptions onto the Romans and their relationship with their neighbors. As you finally drift off to sleep tonight, imagine instead a complex ancient world, where different societies developed different solutions to human problems, where cultural contact involved mutual learning and adaptation, and where civilization took many forms that we're still trying to understand. Sometimes the most important historical lesson is recognizing that the past was more complex, more diverse, and more interesting than our myths suggest. As we approach the end of our journey through Roman myths, let's explore one final misconception that ties all the others together: the idea that Roman civilization disappeared when the empire fell, leaving only ruins and memories that were later rediscovered by Renaissance scholars. This narrative of loss and recovery underlies most popular understanding of European history, the Dark Ages, when classical knowledge vanished, followed by its dramatic revival centuries later. But here's the truth that might gently reshape your understanding as you settle into sleep. Roman civilization never disappeared. It transformed, adapted, and continued through institutions, laws, languages, technologies, and cultural practices that remained alive and functional throughout the medieval period and into the modern world. The myth of disappearance and rediscovery serves powerful cultural narratives about progress, decline, and renewal, but it obscures the actual continuity of Roman influence in European and Mediterranean societies. What we call the fall of Rome was really a gradual transformation of Roman institutions into new forms that served medieval needs, while maintaining connections to imperial precedents. The Catholic Church, which emerged as the dominant institution in post-imperial Western Europe, was itself a Roman creation that preserved and transmitted Roman administrative methods, legal concepts, and intellectual traditions. Church hierarchy was modeled on imperial bureaucracy. Canon law incorporated principles from Roman jurisprudence. Papal administration used Roman governmental techniques adapted to religious purposes. Medieval monasteries served as centers of learning that preserved not just classical texts but Roman approaches to education, agriculture, and technology. Monasteries maintained libraries, operated schools, developed new agricultural techniques, and created networks of communication that functioned much like Roman administrative systems. The famous medieval copying of classical manuscripts wasn't rescue from oblivion, it was continuation of ongoing intellectual traditions. The Holy Roman Empire, which dominated Central European politics for nearly 1,000 years, represented explicit continuation of Roman imperial ideology. Holy Roman emperors claimed direct succession from Augustus and Constantine. Imperial ceremonies, legal codes, and administrative practices deliberately modeled themselves on Roman precedents. This wasn't antiquarian nostalgia, but functional political continuity. Medieval legal systems throughout Europe incorporated Roman law principles that had never been abandoned. The University of Bologna, founded in the 11th century, became Europe's leading center for legal education, partly because it had maintained continuous traditions of Roman legal scholarship. Medieval lawyers studied Justinian's legal codes, not as archaeological artifacts, but as living law applicable to contemporary disputes. Medieval cities, especially in Italy, maintained Roman municipal institutions, with only gradual modifications. Italian city-states like Venice, Genoa, and Florence developed governmental systems that combined Roman administrative methods with new forms of commercial and political organization. These weren't revivals of classical practices, but evolutionary developments from Roman precedents. The technological continuity is equally impressive. Roman engineering techniques remained in use throughout the medieval period. Adapted to local conditions and materials, medieval builders constructed churches using Roman architectural principles. Medieval engineers maintained Roman roads, aqueducts, and bridges, making repairs and modifications that kept these systems functional for centuries after imperial collapse. Agricultural practices also showed remarkable continuity. Medieval farming used crop rotation, soil management, and animal husbandry techniques that derived from Roman agricultural manuals. Medieval estate management incorporated Roman approaches to labor organization, resource allocation, and productivity maximization. The famous medieval agricultural revolution built upon Roman foundations rather than replacing them. Even medieval warfare maintained connections to Roman military traditions. Medieval military engineering used siege techniques developed by Roman armies. Medieval cavalry tactics incorporated methods that had evolved from late Roman military practice. Medieval fortification design showed clear influences from Roman military architecture. The persistence of Latin as the language of learning, administration, and diplomacy throughout medieval Europe represented direct continuity rather than artificial revival. Medieval Latin evolved naturally from late Roman forms, developing new vocabulary and grammatical structures, while maintaining essential continuity with classical traditions. Trade networks also maintained Roman connections. Medieval Mediterranean commerce followed routes established during the imperial period. Commercial law incorporated Roman legal principles. Business practices developed from Roman precedents. The famous medieval Italian banking families used financial techniques that derived from Roman commercial methods. Educational institutions showed similar continuity. Medieval cathedral schools and universities used teaching methods developed in late Roman schools. The medieval curriculum, the trivium and quadrivium, was based on Roman educational theory. Medieval scholarly methods incorporated Roman approaches to textual analysis, logical argument, and intellectual debate. Religious and intellectual traditions also maintained Roman connections. Medieval Christian theology developed from patristic authors who were themselves products of Roman educational and intellectual culture. Medieval philosophy incorporated Roman authors like Cicero, Seneca, and Boethius, who had never been forgotten. Medieval political theory drew upon Roman concepts of law, authority, and civic duty. Archaeological evidence supports this narrative of continuity rather than disappearance. Medieval settlements often show clear development from Roman sites. Medieval building techniques incorporated Roman materials and methods. Medieval material culture demonstrates ongoing use of Roman technologies and artistic traditions. The Renaissance rediscovery of classical antiquity was really a renewed emphasis on certain aspects of Roman culture that had remained continuously available. Humanist scholars didn't rescue forgotten texts from oblivion. They promoted particular interpretations of Roman remnant philosophy that served contemporary intellectual and political needs. What changed during the Renaissance wasn't the availability of Roman sources, but attitudes toward them. Medieval scholars had studied Roman texts as part of living intellectual traditions. Renaissance humanists approached them as models for cultural renewal and political reform. This represented a shift in emphasis, rather than recovery from disappearance. The printing press facilitated wider distribution of classical texts, but these texts had remained available in manuscript form throughout the medieval period. Printing made classical literature more accessible and standardized, but it didn't rescue it from extinction. Modern European institutions continue to show Roman influences that were never interrupted. Legal systems throughout Europe incorporate Roman legal principles. Government structures use Roman administrative methods. Educational institutions employ Roman pedagogical approaches. Even contemporary political vocabulary derives largely from Latin terms that were never abandoned. As you drift into final sleep tonight, consider how this pattern of continuity and transformation applies to other aspects of cultural transmission. Civilizations rarely disappear completely. They evolve, adapt, and continue in new forms that maintain connections to their origins, while serving contemporary needs. Sometimes what we call historical revival is simply renewed appreciation for traditions that never actually disappeared, and what we call progress is often creative adaptation of ancient wisdom to modern circumstances. Here we are at the end of our gentle journey through Roman myths, and perhaps you're wondering what all this historical myth-busting actually means. Why does it matter whether Nero actually fiddled, whether gladiators usually died, or whether Romans invented the technologies we attribute to them? As you settle into your final moments of wakefulness tonight, let me suggest that these Roman myths reveal something profound about how we understand ourselves and our world. Every myth we've examined serves psychological and cultural purposes that go far beyond historical accuracy. When we imagine Nero fiddling while Rome burned, we're really expressing anxieties about political leadership and social responsibility. When we picture gladiators fighting to the death, we're exploring questions about violence, entertainment, and human dignity. When we assume Romans spoke only Latin, we're revealing assumptions about cultural unity and imperial power. The persistence of these myths suggests that they meet deep human needs for clear narratives about power, civilization, and cultural development. We want our historical figures to embody simple moral lessons. We want ancient civilizations to provide either inspiring examples or cautionary tales. We want the past to make sense in ways that illuminate the present and guide future decisions. But reality is always more complex than mythology, and that complexity is often more interesting and more useful than simplified narratives. The real Romans, with their multicultural empire, their borrowed technologies, their complex social systems, and their gradual transformation into medieval European civilization, offer richer lessons about human adaptability, cultural exchange, and historical change than the mythical Romans of popular imagination. Consider what we learn from the reality behind Roman myths. Romans succeeded, not through superior innovation, but through systematic adaptation of ideas from throughout their empire. They built lasting institutions, not by imposing uniform culture, but by incorporating diverse traditions. They created political stability not through democratic ideals, but through pragmatic management of competing interests. These lessons have obvious relevance to contemporary challenges. In our globalized world, success often comes from ability to learn from different cultures, rather than from assuming inherent superiority. Effective institutions require flexibility and adaptation, rather than rigid adherence to traditional forms. Political stability depends on managing diversity rather than enforcing uniformity. The Roman approach to cultural borrowing offers particularly valuable insights for modern societies struggling with questions of cultural identity and change. Romans weren't threatened by adopting useful innovations from conquered peoples. They saw it as practical wisdom that strengthened their civilization. They maintained Roman identity while incorporating Greek philosophy, Celtic military techniques, Germanic legal concepts, and Persian administrative methods. This suggests a model of cultural confidence that's neither defensive nor aggressive. Secure civilizations can learn from others without losing their essential character. Cultural exchange enriches rather than threatens societies that approach it with curiosity and pragmatism rather than fear and chauvinism. The Roman understanding of citizenship also offers lessons for contemporary debates about membership, identity, and belonging. Romans gradually expanded citizenship to include people from throughout their empire, regardless of ethnic origin or cultural background. By the 3rd century CE, anyone born within Roman territories was a Roman citizen, creating a genuinely multicultural, imperial identity. This wasn't modern multiculturalism. Romans certainly had hierarchies and prejudices, but it was a practical recognition that successful empires must incorporate rather than simply dominate diverse populations. Roman citizenship became a legal and political category that transcended ethnic and cultural boundaries. The Roman approach to religion offers another model for managing diversity in pluralistic societies. Rather than imposing uniform beliefs, Romans generally allowed local religious practices to continue alongside imperial cults. They absorbed useful elements from foreign religions, while maintaining traditional Roman ceremonial functions. This created religious syncretism that satisfied both local communities and imperial administrative needs. The gradual Christianization of the Roman Empire followed similar patterns. Christianity wasn't imposed by imperial decree, but spread through normal social and cultural processes. When Constantine legalized Christianity, He was recognizing an already established reality rather than creating a new religious order. The transformation happened through persuasion, adaptation, and negotiation rather than force or dramatic conversion. These historical examples suggest that lasting cultural change happens through patient processes of adaptation and integration, rather than sudden transformation or revolutionary disruption. Successful societies find ways to preserve essential continuity while accommodating necessary change. The Roman legal tradition offers perhaps the most direct contemporary relevance. Roman concepts of law, evidence, precedent, and legal procedure continue to influence modern legal systems throughout the world. But Roman law succeeded not because it was perfect, but because it was flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances, while maintaining core principles of consistency and fairness. Roman administrative techniques also remain relevant for modern organizational challenges. The Roman military's approach to training, logistics, and command structure influenced military organization for centuries. Roman bureaucratic methods provided models for efficient administration of large, diverse populations. Roman approaches to infrastructure development and maintenance offer lessons for contemporary public works projects. But perhaps the most important lesson from Roman history is about the relationship between myth and reality in cultural memory. The Romans we remember, the mythical Romans of popular imagination, serve important cultural functions, but they can also mislead us about how successful civilizations actually work. Real Romans succeeded through pragmatism, adaptation, and systematic organization, rather than through dramatic heroism or cultural superiority. They built their empire through patient negotiation and institutional development, rather than through spectacular military conquest. They maintained power through effective administration and cultural incorporation, rather than through dramatic displays of authority. These mundane virtues, competent administration, cultural flexibility, systematic organization, pragmatic problem-solving, don't make for exciting stories, but they're probably more relevant to contemporary challenges than the dramatic narratives we prefer to remember. As you finally drift off to sleep, carrying these corrected stories into your dreams, remember that the goal isn't to diminish Roman achievements, but to understand them more accurately. The real Romans accomplished remarkable things through very human processes of learning, adaptation, and gradual improvement. Their successes came from recognizing good ideas regardless of their origin and implementing them systematically across vast territories and diverse populations. Sometimes the most inspiring historical lessons come not from myths about exceptional people doing impossible things, but from understanding how ordinary people, even very successful ordinary people, solved practical problems through patience, wisdom, and hard work. The Romans built one of history's most successful civilizations, not by being superhuman, but by being remarkably, persistently, and intelligently human. Sweet dreams, and remember, history is always more interesting than the myths we tell about it. And there you have it, 17 chapters of gently exploded Roman myths to carry you into sleep. If your brain feels pleasantly scrambled by all these historical corrections, you know exactly which buttons to press. Until next time, sleep well with the real Romans, not the Hollywood ones.